So not all of Latin American crime is due to drug trafficking. Like in El Salvador, a lot of that crime has been protection rackets, whereby criminals say to businesses, you've got to pay up or we're going to punch, kill you. But in much of Latin America, the crime is criminal gangs trying to make a lot of money in response to Western demand for drugs. And as long as that Western demand for drugs remains high, as long as criminal gangs can make a lot of money from selling drugs, then they are like any market actor, that they rationally respond to that violence. And so if the security improves in Colombia, then the traffickers move to Ecuador. So that's another big challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially in the case of El Salvador, which got very famous with Bukele as a president. But again, like when you look at the details of the criminality, or for example, the profit margin of your criminal activity, it plays a big role on how much money you have to invest in protection and changing strategies to keep your business running. So if this is not taken into account, it can lead to very simple solutions that might never work.
Yeah, so this is what I found so fascinating. So Chris Blattman, who has a wonderful book, Why We Fight, he's got a more recent paper analyzing what works. And he says what's really important in analyzing and responding to crime is to have a local diagnosis. So what exactly is driving the crime in Rio? What exactly is driving the crime in Medellin, for example? And he highlights that El Salvador in the early 2000s, they did this process of mass arrest and it was totally ineffective. He also highlights that even though Bukele's strategy seems to be successful for now, his 2022 crackdown, actually the homicides were declining from 2015. So they were already going down. And what he highlights is that happened then is there was this secretive truce, this pact between the criminal leaders and also the government. And maybe that also helped them having the process of mass arrest. And what's also crucial, he argues, in El Salvador is that you didn't have so many international drug traffickers, rather you had these protection rackets. So his argument is that if it was a story of drug traffickers, then once you locked up a lot of criminals, then you get replacement. But because it wasn't that sort of international demand, then you didn't have the replacement criminals. So Chris Blattman's point there is that these mass arrests aren't necessarily effective. And even though many Latin Americans who are super fed up and frustrated with the violence, actually, Chris Blattman argues that actually some of these mano duro solutions don't necessarily work. And what's really much more important is to build people's confidence in the rule of law, is to build people's belief that the state can reduce violence and that the state is going to provide checks and balances, and the state is going to provide law and order. So just having a bunch of kamikaze, crazy cops going into an area and beating everyone up and shooting 50 guys or whatever, it doesn't necessarily make people safer. There are many instances where there's been a mano duro approach and that hasn't worked. Now, I'm not saying that as someone who instinctively recoils about police aggression. All I care about is the outcomes, right? And if the outcomes are not working, if the outcomes are not making people safer, then we want to rethink whether that's an effective intervention.
Yeah, it's complicated, especially when you already have a violent society like Brazil, and then you hear about Bukele and how successful he has been just by imprisoning or establishing like the mano duro or like iron fist state. This will definitely inspire other politicians. I think he got very famous in the US.
Yeah, totally. And I think there are two really important distinguishing features. So as I was saying, in El Salvador, Chris Blattman's argument is that the criminals were not responding to a popular demand. They were doing something very unpopular. They were extracting rents by creating these protection rackets. No one wants a protection racket. No business says, we really want someone to force us to pay up on threat of violence. What's different about, say, Rio de Janeiro is that the commodities boom did enable, and rising inequality means that you have a more affluent section of society that's purchasing drugs, for example, among other things. So in Rio de Janeiro, you've got this local demand for illicit goods, and then different criminal syndicates compete to supply that demand. And let's suppose you totally destroyed and decimated one criminal syndicate. Okay, great, well done. Now a new criminal syndicate will form to supply that existing demand for drugs. So that's the problem, right? So I think the argument is saying, yes, we need a strong and effective state. We need a government that can improve the rule of law. And that doesn't necessarily mean just smashing people's heads in. So, for example, another place that's seen a big improvement in safety has been San Francisco. San Francisco used to have really high levels of homicides and violence, and it's just seen its lowest level of homicides in 60 years. And part of that has just been enforcing the rule of law. Like, the police aren't going around killing people. The police are enforcing the rule of law and doing their job, right? So it's just about having an effective state with the capacity.